Hey, hey, U.S. history students. This is Mr. Baker. Hope you're doing well. This is another installment of Baker's Corner. We're actually going to be spending this next couple of class sessions analyzing and thinking about a lot of the developments that are a part of the American West. We're kind of coming back to the after effects, if you will, of the manifest destiny and all this land that we've been obviously gaining control over. And the thing I want us to kind of start off with, guys, is the kind of a big picture question, and that is, does anything come to mind when you all think of the West? Like, if you've ever seen like any westerns, like with John Wayne, or some of the TV shows like Gunsmoke, things like that. And for a lot of us guys, the West is kind of a neat place because it represents areas that Americans are moving out to. They're exploring. They're obviously you're in some cases, you're going to see a lot more population change and movement. And the other side of it, guys, keep in mind, is that we almost always hear about the, things involving like cowboys and the Plains Native Americans and things. So we're looking really at a period, guys, of during and also post Civil War to an extent up until I would say around 1890, give or take a few years. Okay. And so the question that we want to ask ourselves, feel free to pause if you need to, is what draws people to the West? In other words, the pull factors. What is in the West or things associated with the West that people, guys, are going to be like, yeah, this is a good place to move to. Okay. And then also, guys, the other side of the coin here is push factors. Now, I don't know if any of you have ever taken like AP Human Geography or perhaps another social studies where you study movement or migration. But guys, remember, migration really refers to movement, right? So we're going from place to place. A push factor, a way to think about a push factor is what is kind of pushing you from where you are, okay? So in other words, the big question there is, why are you leaving where you're from? Okay. So, like, for example, in my case, a lot of you guys know from previous lessons, I'm from originally Ohio. Why does Mr. Baker move from Ohio to a state like North Carolina, right? And there's a little bit more of a complex answer, but we're going to make it kind of basic. Part of it was, the push factor was, all right, you've got family change happening, you've got, education that you want to seek somewhere else. So you're being pushed elsewhere. Now, take a look, guys, at what's going on during and also after the Civil War. So we've got joblessness. Okay, guys, remember the Civil War is a humongous war that time period, if you will, that we've talked quite a bit about the last few weeks, but also even with the after effects of Reconstruction. And guys, remember this war has a lot of effects on Northerners, but also particularly Southerners, particularly the freedmen population. We'll come back to that. Okay. So the West represents opportunity, all right, which is also going to be a pull factor, okay? Costly farmland in the East. For those of you that might be from the Northeast or somewhere like Boston or somewhere like that, New York, parts of it anyway, guys, it is extremely costly to be able to have access to land, right? So when you have all these pieces of land, all these acres that the government is trying to encourage people, guys, to actually take into consideration, you're looking at being landless as a pull factor or push factor, right? We don't have land. That's pushing us away. We're going to where opportunity is there. Religious repression, guys, if you're familiar with the Mormon migration westward, those of you that are familiar a little bit more, these people took upon a set of beliefs that were associated with some of the ideas of Joseph Smith. Not exactly, going to be in areas across the board in the East that are going to be as most accepting. So what do? They move westward into especially parts of present-day Utah, Salt Lake City particularly. Okay. And so therefore, these people want kind of like a safe haven to be able to practice their beliefs and and some of the things that they associate with religion. And then also, guys, when you're looking at it from the standpoint of immigration, okay, so think about people, guys, that are outside the United States, right? So this could be Europeans, these could be people from Mexico, parts of Asia, even if you're looking at some of the jobs available. But guys, what's happening is that you have a lot of revolution that's taking place in parts of Europe. Okay. Now, and a lot of you guys are familiar with the famous potato famine of the Irish. Okay. Well, we're seeing more migration from other places too that will continue to kind of move us in this direction. Okay. And then the pull factor. What is bringing people, okay, to want to settle the West, to want to hang their hat there, as the saying goes? Well, a couple of things. First of all, the railroad. Okay, guys, there's a lot of land out there that the federal government is giving incentives for people to build railroads. Therefore, the railroad has to be built, right? So therefore, you're going to see a lot of people. A lot of them are Irish immigrants, Chinese, other, of course, natural-born Americans as well. Okay, and so therefore, these land grant acts are exactly the way that they sound. So the government says, okay, here's a big tract of land. We want to be able to build this railroad. Now, guys, remember, this railroad concept is not really brand new, but the idea of a railroad that's eventually going to connect both coasts from east to west, etc., that is not really going to happen until the Civil War is over. Okay? But all of these acts that you see passed right here are going to be passed during the Civil War. Okay? And so therefore, the North is very much in favor of this. And later on, we'll see the expansion a little bit in the southern states too, but particularly the northern, or some of the areas westward. The Morrill Land Grant Act, we'll come back to this. But guys, imagine those of you that really find colleges interesting, if you follow college sports, or even those of you that might be looking to college. If you've heard of universities like North Carolina State or Ohio State or Virginia Tech or Georgia Tech, Kansas State, etc., those are what we call land grant colleges. Okay. And so what they would do is the government guys would give these states and areas money. They would sell the land, and they would then use that money to actually start some of these colleges. Now, think, guys, when we think of a lot of these colleges, NC State, Ohio State, Michigan State, even Clemson, etc., what are some of the things that they're especially going to specialize in? Okay. Well, it's not to say that you can't go to those universities to study liberal arts and things like that, but the big concentration of why they're founded originally is going to be things in the area of things like agriculture, all right, technology. Today that would be also investing a little bit more like sciences, engineering, mathematics. So you're looking, guys, at a lot of STEM things and agricultural. Okay. And last but not least, the idea of the Homestead Act. Okay. So guys, imagine 1862 rolls around, you're somebody in the East, right? Pretend that you're maybe a female, a couple of children, maybe you lost a husband to the Civil War. So, you want a fresh start. Guys, what the Homestead Act basically said is, you know what? The head of the household. Now, that is not unique to men, not unique to women. In other words, anybody can take that over if they can claim that. 21 years of age, I believe, was the cutoff age for age requirement. And you had to basically agree to live on this land and improve it for 5 years. Okay. To be able to justify keeping the land long term. Okay. The question, guys, I want you to think about before we look at a couple of other things is, what would be an improvement? Okay. Well, a couple of things to keep in mind, and we looked at this a moment ago, is the idea, guys, of all these things are pulling people, okay, to settle the West. Now, you'll notice I have the emblem here of North Carolina State University, okay, which is in the state that I currently reside, North Carolina. Okay, but guys, you can look at your own states. Most of them actually have land grant colleges. If you've ever heard of historically black universities or colleges, you also see those that are started around this time moving forward. And there's also going to develop even these that fall within the category of universities and colleges or schools, in other words, that are actually there for Native Americans, right? So you're going to see some variation with, certain focuses of them, et cetera, as far as who can attend them. Okay. So I want you guys to pause your screen for a moment and ask yourself the question, what comes to mind when you see these two images, right? The Homestead Act is going to be pretty important, okay? And I know about all of you, but for me, again, what do we notice, guys, about the landscape? It's very dry. There's a little bit of water in those streams, but for the most part, guys, you don't see a lot of vegetation. There's not a lot of trees. Therefore, you're going to have to usually get very creative in some ways with how you settle the land. Okay, so if you've ever heard of Little House on the Prairie, right, which is one of my favorite shows growing up in the 70s and 80s, okay, there's a lot of references to things like this where people are living fairly primitive lifestyles. And guys, think about it like this. If you get out there, pretend that you're this lady in the picture, okay? So, you can see the child here, probably a kid there as well. We don't know, was the husband there, but he's off trying to get the place started. Okay, what's going to be the most difficult challenge of getting started on one of these homesteads, which is basically a piece of land that, again, you're trying to improve? Okay, now, guys, we can probably assume that in the upper picture here, that these two major improvements have probably been made since the settlers actually settled. Okay, but think about it like this, guys. This picture down here, would we consider homes to be improvements? Absolutely, right? Putting a dwelling on a piece of land. Obviously you can see here that the farmer is using, I'm going to assume that's probably an oxen or something, a plow, plowing a field, making it to where it's arable and you can farm it. Okay. A lot of grain, a lot of wheat in those areas. And then, guys, what do we notice here? We notice technology. Okay. So these improvements, guys, the Homestead Act of 1862 is not really going to be, in my reading of it, guys, very specific with how to improve. It just gives some basic guidelines. Okay. So I read a story a few years ago in a source I was reading that somebody took one of these loopholes in the act, and evidently one of the government officials went out there after 5 years, and they're right smack dab in the middle of the homestead, and they're like, we don't really see a house, we don't see technology, we don't see farming, we don't see barbed wire fences that were used to kind of enclose the area. We'll come back to that in a second. And guys, what they did is they looked really closely, and according to the testimony of the story, somebody had put like a little 4x6, almost like a house, but it was something that probably, if you're a kid or something, you might be able to play in, but it's certainly not going to be really probably what they envision with improvements. But because of the loophole with not having specifics about how to do it, I think, guys, if I recall correctly, that person actually got to keep the land. Okay, and guys, you got to remember, those of us that are used to being fairly close to Walmart and Home Depot and places like Lowe's and Ace, etc., there is nothing like that, guys, around you. Okay, so that is one of the things that you're going to see, guys, developing in these Great Plains in the settlement of the West. You're going to have people that are settling homesteads and farms. You're going to have some people that go out there because of the mining culture, which is also pretty interesting, but also very dangerous, keep in mind. And then you're also going to have people that were actually big into ranching, right? The idea of the beef industry starts to become a larger industry, which is going to eventually become, as we know, a big business. Okay. Now, I want y'all guys to take a quick look at this map. And this is kind of a neat little story. What do we notice? Now, this map is a little bit difficult to read, so I'm going to have to kind of break it down. But guys, if you take a look here, you'll notice that all of these areas that are in the purplish color, all right, what do we notice about their location? All but one of them is going to be west of the Mississippi River. Okay, so the Mississippi is right there. The only one that's going to be west of there, east of there, pardon me, is going to be the state of New York, right? Now, these states that gave full suffrage to women, all right, and guys, I want you to think what we might mean by that, okay, are going to be the ones that we see in the purple, okay? So what is full suffrage for women? This is going to be, guys, women have the right to vote in general elections for the presidency. They can elect their congressmen. They can elect their state or territorial officials. They can elect their local, representatives. So, for example, mayors and county officials. In other words, guys, women are given pretty much these rights. Now, something to keep in mind is, why would we see more women's suffrage west of here? Well, guys, think back to the previous picture. Okay, women are going to be one of the more essential pieces of the puzzle with westward settlement. Okay, a lot of them are going to be going out there. They're not going to be tremendously wealthy, as you can see. A lot of them are going to be probably single mothers. Maybe they lost their husbands, or for whatever reason, their husband is not really as involved out there because of whatever reason. Okay, and so therefore, guys, what we notice is that the western part of the United States is going to be known as being more progressive. Okay, and this is one way. Okay, and we're eventually going to have a pretty well-known historian in the earlier 1890s. We'll look at him if we have time next time. And his name is Frederick Jackson Turner. Okay, and Turner wrote what was called the Frontier Thesis. Okay, and there's a lot of things that he has to say in this. This is kind of like his bread and butter work. Almost everybody, guys, has heard of him. That's one of the first things that comes to mind, but that is the Turner Thesis. By the way, he was a well-known historian from the University of Wisconsin. Okay, and so anyway, but one thing, guys, that he writes about with the West, he's trying to sell people on the importance of the westward development. All right, because according to him and other historians, it's one of the least explored of the areas of American history. All right, so anyway, it's why we're spending about a week on it. Okay, but anyway, but Turner, one of the things that he contends, I think pretty well throughout that work, is he makes the argument that one of the bigger things is the democratic heritage that's continuing to kind of build with westward development and expansion. And this example, guys, of women's suffrage or voting rights is a perfect example. Okay, if you're kind of wondering, what are we noticing, guys, with many of these states over here, especially in the South, most of the South, these are states that actually are not opening up the rights to vote to women at this period of time. And so a lot of you guys are wondering, well, Mr. Baker, we know that eventually women across the board do get the right to vote. Okay, when is that going to be? That's going to be 1920 with the 19th Amendment. Okay, but these states that you see, guys, and especially the purple, these are areas or territories, states as well later on, that are actually opening up suffrage to women. So in some states, you do have the right to vote because the state constitutions allow you to, if you're a female, 21, etc. Okay, whereas in a lot of states, as you can see clearly, guys, not so much. All right, so that 19th Amendment becomes a pretty essential piece of the Constitution down the line. Okay, all right. This is another example, guys, of what we're talking about. Just something to keep in mind. 1919, 1920 is going to be when we see formally that amendment that becomes constitutional. Okay, when we have the 19th Amendment, there's not a single state, guys, in the Union that can then decline or declare that women do not have the right to vote. Okay, and again, you notice, guys, this block that's in the blue, it's a little bit different color than the previous map, but something to keep in mind. Okay, so not anything, guys, to really memorize too much here, but keep in mind, what are we noticing with population change? We're noticing that, again, by about a 5-year window after the Civil War is over, we notice that a lot of this area, especially eastern, has been settled. And then you'll notice within the next 10 to 20 years, we are noticing quite a bit of settlement. Okay, but keep in mind, you do have some sparsely populated areas that are not going to be as dense. Now, eventually, guys, a lot of you guys, if you've ever seen a map of the Electoral College today is in 2020, then a lot of you guys are like, well, man, Mr. Baker, California has the most electoral votes now of any state. This map doesn't really show their full population. That is true, right? But you got to remember, guys, that's over time. Okay, it's very similar if you're talking about the population of Florida, right? Florida really starts to pretty much build upon itself a lot, especially, when you move into like the post World War II era, right? The 40s, 50s, 60s, and beyond. Okay, with obviously the development of retirees moving there more, etc. Okay, so just something to keep in the back of our minds. Okay, um, and so who's going to be likely, guys, to settle the West in the largest numbers? This might be worth stopping your screen if you want. Okay, and there's only one major term here that I want to explain to you, right? But when we're talking about the immigration that we've already kind of hinted on, Chinese immigrants are going to be coming in pretty decent numbers until around 1882. Okay, and guys, a lot of you guys might be wondering, well, Mr. Baker, why 1882? And the reason being, guys, is because in 1882, there's going to be an act passed called the Chinese Exclusion Act. We'll look at this a little bit down the line, just to introduce it. And it's literally the way that it sounds, right? So they're going to be really cutting that off. The Irish, both of those groups, guys, are going to be heavily involved in the railroad, as we'll look at here in just a moment. Mexican immigrants, women, and the guys, see where my cursor is, the exodusters. Now, a lot of you guys might be thinking, well, man, maybe if this is not a religion lesson, guys, but if you've ever heard of the Exodus from the Old Testament in the Bible, the one big thing, guys, that you should think about with that is that we're looking at people that have been kind of in a state of slavery or a state of they've been wronged or whatever. And the Exodus is they're moving out of a bad situation and they're moving into one that is more favorable. Okay, well, the Exodusters, that is a term that was actually coined that actually goes back to a lot of African Americans that were actually fleeing parts of, especially the South, for opportunity to do things like own land. Okay, so guys, remember, what's the term that we're using shortly after the Civil War as we see the end of slavery? It's going to be the freedmen, right? So that term will be pretty important. And so the Exodusters were mostly freedmen. Some of them had been free African Americans prior to the end of the Civil War, but keep in mind that's about a couple 100,000 out of about 4 million that were slaves before. Okay, and so it's a pretty big deal. It's opportunity. Okay, now the question I like to pose, guys, is would you have been up for the challenge? Okay, of settling out west? Okay, and that's something that we'll come back to. Okay, now there's one group that we have not talked about extensively that we're going to kind of lay a little bit of groundwork is, guys, and that is what is happening to the Native Americans. Okay, with a lot of these migration westward, right? When you're talking about movements, when you're talking about the idea of building railroads across the continent, which we'll look at more in a second. Okay, and guys, if you take a look here, you'll notice that westward development is going to have a pretty considerable impact on these Native American Plains tribes. Okay, again, feel free to stop here if you need to. Now, guys, I don't know if any of you know much about the Plains tribes. I'll show you a map on the next slide, but a lot of these tribes are very nomadic. All right, do any of you know what that means? All right, and a lot of you probably have heard that word before. So it means that they move, right? They're not like the Aztecs and the Incas and the Mayans and some of the Eastern tribes that were more, settled. These are going to be tribes that actually go where the resources are. And what's the most important resource to a lot of their culture? It's going to be, of course, the bison or the buffalo, right? And the bison, guys, is going to be extremely essential. It, if you think about it, it provides food, it provides clothing. I read a story once that said that even when they used the bladders of some of these animals, of course, after they're dead, been killed, that they would actually use those to kind of hold things like water and liquids and things. And then also, guys, keep in mind, even the bones would be used to actually use for things like eating utensils and things like that, right? So literally, guys, when we say that in a sense the bison was essential to the culture and the way of life of these Plains tribes, we're not really making an overestimate there. Okay. There's a case to be made, if you're interested in knowing this, guys, that some historians contend, and I think it makes a lot of sense if you think about it, that the destruction of the bison is, if not the biggest factor that impacted the eventual movement of Plains tribes onto the reservations later on, certainly one of the bigger factors. Okay. So mining, ranching, and also, of course, the railway construction. Now, think about mining. Guys, what do you get? What kind of things do people mine? Okay. Well, they mine resources, right? They mine things like oil, right, or iron ore. Excuse me. They mine things like silver, gold, etc. So what happens? Okay, if you're a Native American tribe and you think that you have rights to land, and guys, a lot of these people go upon the land, they find these resources, they're going to want to actually capitalize on them. And that's where you start to have a lot of conflict. So you notice all these different things that start to happen. All right. And the American military is going to get involved, right? Partly during the Civil War, by the way, and also the years leading up to the latter part of the 1800s. Okay. And then also ranching. Guys, if you think about it, you're going to have a lot of people that know that they can make money, okay, off of the idea of things like beef, right? So cattle, right? So you're going to see a really big push on that. All right, we'll come back to that here in a moment when we get to the idea of the railroads. Okay, so there's going to be a lot of dissension. Guys, treaties were attempted unsuccessfully. Okay, and so take a moment to maybe pause your screen and ask yourself the question: what is really the trend that we see between the map on the left and the map on the right? Okay, and take into consideration context. Okay, so guys, take a look here. 1850. That's before the Civil War has started. Okay, so what do we notice? We notice that all this land, minus a very small piece of Texas, a little bit of what it looks like to be New Mexico, and as you can see, probably about maybe a quarter of California, perhaps, that is supposed to be land in the purple there that is for the Native Americans, right? To be able to move, to be able to have opportunity to kind of, go and do their thing with their culture. And guys, what do we notice over here? We notice a lot of change. Okay. Now, a couple of things to keep in mind. All these areas, guys, that you see here are actually going to be areas that we associate with reservations. Okay. So the Navajo, the Hopi, the Apache is another group that you hear about, to remember about memorizing all these. The Ute, also, guys, a big important tribe. Chief Joseph will look at in a second. The Sioux tribe, okay, and then of course you notice, guys, a decent number of battles that take place. Probably the most well-known one, which we'll reference very briefly, guys, in the next few slides, is going to be the Battle of Little Bighorn. Okay, that's what we call Custer's Last Stand, where he basically is going to be wiped out by one of the tribes there. Okay, and then guys, take a look here. Okay, this is a little bit of a review. So what kind of tribes do we mostly see here? We see the Chickasaw, the Choctaw, the Seminole, the Creek, and also, as you can see, the Cherokee. Those should sound familiar because of the Trail of Tears, right? So they're all there. And guys, Oklahoma becomes an area that, you could say, well, man, that's where they're supposed to settle. Eventually, they're going to open up this area for settlement by other groups, particularly Caucasian Americans. Okay. All right. So, real big thing here, guys. I'm kind of hitting the surface here. So keep in mind, when you're talking about the idea of the Plains tribes, okay, keep in mind one thing I think that's important, and that is that these tribes, I think, guys, are heavily organized. They have leadership. They obviously are, people that, they trade, they have rivalries with other tribes. Okay. In other words, they have conflicts and things like that. Okay. And so therefore, you'll notice, guys, these are probably, Geronimo is another one that I did not put on the slide here, guys. But if you take a look here, just keep in mind these leaders. All right. Chief Joseph, Sitting Bull, Crazy Horse. Okay. And I want you guys to try to put yourself in their shoes. Okay. So a couple of key battles. So you notice the first one here, Sand Creek Massacre. That's the year before the end of the Civil War happens. Okay. Battle of Little Bighorn happens about a dozen years later, as you can see. And then you'll notice, guys, the Battle of Wounded Knee. Okay. So Wounded Knee is going to be, as you can see, right there. Okay. And guys, if you take a look here, you'll notice that Wounded Knee is going to be the last of the major engagements. Okay. So ask yourself the question. Again, we're not talking too much about the details because of time, but I want you guys to try to put yourself in the shoes of the leadership, right? What would 1890 require you to probably do? You got to really process and think about the magnitude of what's happening. Because, guys, if you think about it, if you're losing population, okay, and keep in mind these Native American populations, each one of these tribes, in a sense, guys, represents a different culture, a different way of life. You know, some people would even say kind of like nations, right? So they all have their own languages and customs and things like that. Okay, so think about it like this. When you start to have these engagements happening, you're losing population of your tribe. Okay, and the problem with this, guys, if you think about it, and we'll look at this more on the next slide, is if you basically keep losing population, you know, to war and conflict, right? Because after all, there's a lot more soldiers in the army, you know, that are actually taking on these tribes. You know, you got to ask yourself the question: what is in your tribe's best interest? Is it to keep fighting, or is it to basically live on a reservation and at least keep some semblance, okay, of your culture? Okay. So in 1890, guys, there's a quote out there if you want to research it by Chief Joseph, where, you know, he's very saddened for good reason, but he's like, I shall fight no more forever. Okay. And so to kind of wrap this up, okay, before we wrap up the entire lesson, is think about why these conflicts and these Native Americans or Plains Indians wars, as they're also known as, are important. Okay. Now, these are big things that are tough to kind of process because, guys, tribes are losing population. You know, you've got people moving into their territory against their will. Okay. And so people start to actually take notice, right? Like anything, they write about it, they speak about it, you know, they talk about it, etc. And this might be worth stopping the slide, guys, from or the video. But the lady by the name of Helen Hunt Jackson, that's her picture right there. Okay. She wrote a famous book called A Century of Dishonor. Okay. And it's kind of an interesting read. And there's kind of two things, guys, that I've taken out of this work as I've read bits and pieces of it over the years. The first thing is that I think she does show a degree of sympathy to the Native American population for these conflicts, et cetera, et cetera. So that is a good thing, right? She's making people aware, you know, look at what happened. Okay. But this is where there's a degree of criticism of her work. And this kind of leads us into the Dawes Severalty Act as well. Okay. So think about it like this. So you're showing sympathy. You're like, okay, you know, these people have been wronged. You know, their land has been taken, you know, whether that land is literally, you know, the land itself or the resources that the land provides that you're, you know, taking advantage of or whatever. Okay. There's a very broad way to refer to that concept. Okay. And so what does she suggest? She's like, well, it might be in the best interest of these tribes to assimilate to culture of, let's say, white America. Okay. Now, think about what that word means. What does it mean to assimilate? You know, you can look it up on, you know, on you or not YouTube, excuse me, on Google, right? But the basic nuts and bolts of assimilation is that you're adopting the customs of a different culture. Okay. So for example, all right, guys, look at this. So in the 1870s, okay, they're going to make a decision to actually encourage, you know, the tribes to become more civilized, as it says. Now, those are the words of the act, not mine. Okay. But the Dawes Severalty Act, also known as the Dawes Act, guys, is going to extend citizenship. So one big thing to consider noting here is the fact that prior to this act, most of these tribes had been dealt with as almost like separate nations, like I just said. Okay. So, for example, you're dealing with the Seminole separately than the Sioux, separately from the Arapaho, etc. Okay. What this is really trying to do, guys, is trying to put them under one umbrella, which is why citizenship is emphasized. Okay, so your group is going to be able to become citizens. Now, what does it mean to adopt the habits of a civilized life? Okay, this can become very controversial, but guys, at the end of the day, the way that a lot of people interpreted this is learning the English language, possibly adopting the religious customs of a lot of the majority of the United States, which would have been some form of Christianity. Okay. Possibly adopting different dress patterns. Okay. Guys, I don't have it in the slide, but you can Google it. There's a really neat picture of a Native American group. It's actually in Pennsylvania, so it's not in this area. It's called the Carlisle, I think it was called the Carlisle School, Carlisle. And guys, it's kind of neat to see what these Native Americans looked like prior to attending this school, and then the kind of dress that they did afterwards. It's very different, right? You know, when we think of like or traditional Native American dress, a lot of times, you know, especially Plains tribes, we probably think of, you know, some of the different dressing styles that they had, not wearing like, you know, primitive suits and things, but more their cultural things. You notice a lot of these people, guys, in those pictures actually representing, you know, that living in houses that are not just, you know, let's say like teepees and things. Okay, so again, some people would say that's civilized, that's Americanizing them. Okay, all right. Last but not least, the influx of the railroad. Okay, now the railroad, guys, keep in mind, is going to be kind of like this up and coming important form of transportation that's not new, right? But the idea of connecting the United States from coast to coast is pretty important. Okay, so during the 1830s and 40s, you know, we've already seen quite a bit of building of things like regular roads, canals, you know, things like that. You know, people start to figure out that, you know, when you've got this locomotive, right? Okay, and you can actually allow that to go across distances and it's faster, it's going to allow you to have a faster system of trade, you know, faster mail system, a faster way of getting people from place to place, you know, families and things. Okay. And so what do? They start to really emphasize. Now, when I say they, let me clarify that. That's a very broad term. This could be government giving land to build it. It could be people, guys, that are, let's say, wealthy people, like if you've ever heard of Cornelius Vanderbilt or Leland Stanford, who, by the way, both have universities named after them, right? So they're pretty well-known guys. They're going to take it upon themselves to be like, yep, we have some money to be made here. And so therefore, they're going to start to invest in the railroad. Okay, as does people like J.P. Morgan later on. All right, he was also very wealthy. Okay, but you got to be able to build the railroad and have a railroad be able to function, and that's going to be the purpose of a transcontinental railroad. What does a transcontinental railroad allow the country to do to be connected from coast to coast? Okay, but like anything, guys, it's going to be a matter of convincing people. Okay, what do you do to convince people that their tax dollars need to be invested? There's going to be benefits. Now, guys, remember when we talked about before the Civil War, when you're looking at like internal improvements, one of the big picture things was developing a national economy that's going to allow the economy of the United States to prosper and flourish. You can make a really, really significant connection to the same thing here. Okay? It's going to expand markets. Now, what does that mean, guys? Think about the word market. It's a place where we go to buy and sell goods. Okay. So if we're going somewhere to buy and sell goods, that means that we're going to be taking our goods to cities, towns. Okay. You know, it doesn't matter whether you're a farmer, you know, you're a rancher that actually is going to be driving cattle to eventually go to either slaughterhouses or place to actually sell it. Okay. And guys, think about it like this. If you're a farmer, right, and this is going to be something, guys, we look at next time, okay, you really become very reliant on the railroad, all right? And you could argue, guys, that that's a good problem to have. Okay. And while I would agree, the one thing that I would say about that is that the railroads are going to really understand, okay, that the farmer is pretty much at their beck and call. And so there's going to be a lot of activity that the farmers are going to become very angry about as far as the railroads having their high prices and things like that. And guys, the farmer becomes, we've talked about the era of Jefferson and how Jefferson guys had this big vision of this agricultural republic. Okay. But guys, the farmers are going to become, even in some ways, more political through third parties. All right. And if you're kind of wondering why, that's a topic for next time. Okay. We're going to end here and pick this up next time as we kind of transition to the railroad again. Okay. But guys, something to think about. This is Mr. Baker. This is the tip of the iceberg with the Westward settlement. The next time we're going to look at this quote a little bit, break it down. We're going to try to do a little bit more discussion on the farmers, how they're being affected by conditions in the West. And then last but not least, what do they intend to do politically to try to make some changes happen? Okay. Hope you had a good session. I know I did, guys. This is Baker's Corner. Have a good one. If you need anything, feel free to email me at bakerd@franklinacademy.org. Otherwise, stay safe. And as always, I will see you next time. Thank you.